Hello, I'm Chris Banks and I'm Director of Library Services at Imperial College London, and I'm going to talk about the role of rights retention in supporting open research. So first of all, a bit of background. What's the problem we are trying to solve? Researchers win grants. Grants are awarded to the university and come with the requirement that the resultant research outputs are published immediately open access with a Creative Commons Attribution License, a CC BY license, and that's either to the version of record via a publisher platform or the author-accepted manuscript via a repository. Publishers are increasingly making the first of these routes more expensive. In the case of Nature research journals, €9,500 for publishing a single journal article. And publishers are increasingly making the second of these routes difficult, including presenting authors with contracts which may cause a breach of that researcher institution contract. Many universities waive copyright in favour of the authors, only for those authors to be required to sign away all those rights to publishers. Now, in the UK, we've had what I've described as a blizzard of policy, of open access policy. And this shows you the last 20 years, or nearly 20 years, of our open access policy. Different funders, some funders revising their policies, but it's been quite a blizzard. So in terms of implementing funder open access policy, there is a lot of library involvement because the policy implementation is supported by libraries. Different funder and publisher policies make things complex for authors, and those authors often need to contact libraries for advice, and they're often contacting us multiple times for different articles in different journals funded by different funders. And there's a risk that the publication may not meet the funder obligations, and authors are frustrated. So here's what things looked like in 2016. As from the researcher perspective. So you're a researcher, you've had your idea, you've applied for your research grant, you've hired your staff, you've done your research, you've crunched your data, and you've written up your findings. And then you've got to look at this very, very complex decision tree to work out whether your work is firstly compliant with your funder or funders, and in the UK, whether it's eligible for the Research Excellence Framework, the REF. And authors for a long time have been asking us, just tell me the thing that I need to do. And unfortunately, we couldn't tell them the thing that they could do because often it depended on funder and publisher policies. But there is a thing, and that is a rights retention policy. And the purpose of the policy is to meet funder obligations and to ensure REF eligibility with one single step needed by the author. And the mechanism is a legally sound policy and alignment with the institutional intellectual property policy and the core terms and conditions. And this is not a new approach. The approach of rights retention is in widespread use in Europe and the USA. How it works will depend on the provisions in the copyright law in a country, but globally over 120 institutions have adopted rights retention policies, and it was work undertaken here at Imperial that established the legal mechanism for this to work in the UK. And as at the 20th of May 2024, 28 universities in the UK have implemented and adopted such policies, and that list is growing. And essentially what we needed to do is to bring certain policies into alignment. So first of all, there was our new research publications open access policy, and that replaced what was then our open access policy. And that's where the rights retention clauses are written. We needed to make a minor addition to our intellectual property policy, and we also needed to make some minor additions to the core terms and conditions for Imperial staff and also for clinical staff, so staff on clinical placements. So it replaced our former open access policy and the rights retention policy. Our research publication open access policy confirms that, as with the IP policy, Imperial waives its claim to copyright in research outputs. It applies to the same staff and students as are covered by our intellectual property policy, and it applies currently to peer-reviewed journal articles and conference proceedings. And those covered by the policy grant a non-exclusive sub-license in any author-accepted manuscript to enable Imperial to make it available under a Creative Commons license. So in practice, Imperial undertakes the notification of publishers, and it's this prior notification that ensures that those rights can be retained even when an author subsequently signs an exclusive contract with a publisher. And there's a policy requirement to assign a non-exclusive right in the author-accepted manuscript to Imperial. And to enable open access, each author-accepted manuscript needs to be deposited in Spiral, which is Imperial's repository. My colleagues in library services manage the process and any opt-out requests for specific outputs, although we haven't had any yet. And crucially, the deposited outputs meet funder obligations and are REF eligible. So have we made things easier for our authors? So going back to there's your decision tree as it was back in 2016. It got a little easier in 2020 when Coalition S launched Plan S and many funder policies started to become aligned, and that certainly did help with the decision making, but it was still complicated. But with a research publications rights retention policy, we've made things much easier for authors and therefore also much easier for my colleagues in the library services as well. And then, of course, there are some benefits in our publisher negotiations. Without a policy, we were facing expensive article processing charges and also inequitable access to open access options for authors. But with a rights retention policy, it's available to all authors at the institution, whether or not they're funded. There are no author-facing fees, and it's more sustainable in the face of increasing publishing costs. Thank you for your time.